Hello, and a very, very warm welcome to this fifth session, which is Constructivism. Today we're going to, or for this session I should say, we're going to be looking in great detail at Constructivism, how as a approach, it's largely speaking seen now as one of, if not the most relevant theory for international relations in terms of scholarship, how it challenges the neo-realist and liberal institutionalist paradigms that we've already seen, and how as an approach with its social aspect, the social ontology, what exists, how we know what exists, and the social process, how that as a large umbrella, subsequent theories that we're going to look at in more detail, i.e. Feminism, critical theory, post-structuralism, how each of these theoretical frameworks in a sense come under the large umbrella that is constructivism, due to this aspect of socialization, how meaning is created through norms and other aspects. And so today, in a sense, or for this session again, I should say, I'm comparing and contrasting in some ways with realism and some of the more static materialistic approaches, i.e. realism, particularly neo-realism and liberal institutionalism, and to some extent structural Marxism as well, in the sense that constructivism and some of these more critical approaches to IR theory really takes on board the social element and how actors, how we perceive each other. This is intersubjective element, how we relate to one another, how we perceive each other. So if I perceive you as a friend or as an enemy, I'm going to interact differently towards you, regardless of how much material power you may or may not have as a state or a non-state actor. So this is something that I want to zone in today and really explore with you why constructivism is now considered such an important and central IR theory. And I refer particularly to the scholarship now when I say that. So, constructivism. Now, once again, I have an image for you to ponder, to think about. And as you can see here, some of you may remember from the 360 Karlsday, from wanting to see if you wanted to join the Karlshochschule, and also from the info tag. I used this image when I was talking about why international relations or PPE at the Karlshochschule. And these two images, I think are relevant. They're not the only images that I could have shown to explore constructivism with you for this first slide, but I feel that they're are very relevant in terms of what I want to demonstrate to you, the difference between constructivism and perhaps a more static materialistic approach that is realism or liberal institutionalism. And so you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, I should obviously say from off the bat, and you're all aware, of course, you've got Chancellor Merkel in both pictures. On the left-hand side, you have the Russian President, Vladimir Putin. And on the right image, you have a much closer, more personal, intimate picture of Merkel with Emmanuel Macron, the French President, head of state. And so what I want to do is briefly compare and contrast. Now, constructivists are not just talking about individuals, because it's about actors. So let's say communities, state actors, non-state actors. However, these particular political actors, political figures, broadly speaking, of course, represent their country. So Merkel, obviously, head of the German government, not head of state, unlike in the Russian and French systems where the president is head of state, whereas let's say in the French system and the Russian system, the prime minister is head of government. So Merkel, but that's just a political science difference. The key point, these are the leaders of these three countries, politically speaking, one could argue or say quite conclusively. And you have Merkel and Putin. What do we see? We see so representing their nation states, Germany and Russia, or Germany and France. So we see a wary, not entirely trusting sort of what's going on look between each of them. And then, of course, on the other picture on the right, you see Macron and Merkel, much more intimate, personal, a trust, a warmth, etc., etc. Now, again, these are only two images that I wanted to show you a difference. But basically, when we're looking at constructivism, and you look at France and Germany, neighboring countries, historically had a very difficult relationship with one another. 1870, 1871, the Franco-Prussian War. could even go further back. We go to Napoleonic times. We're talking about the German state here. And then the First World War and the Second World War, obviously the horrors of those world wars. Hypothetically speaking, one would say that France and Germany shouldn't have a good relationship. Why? Because in a sense, they're both part of the G7, so the economies are not too different. Population, of course, Germany's larger, but again, not significantly different. Same with geography, etc. Hypothetically speaking, they could be in a conflictual situation. And conflictual situation for who's the most powerful actor in continental Europe, etc., etc. And yet it's not like this. And why? Well, liberal institutionalists, of course, would argue from last time that with the merging of different institutions, pooling of resources, the Schuman Plan, the formation of European integration, etc., that's played a role. Constructivists would agree with that and add, although constructivists are agnostic, they're not necessarily liberals, conservatives, or left-wing. It just depends on how it's used, constructivism, because there's a social ontology. But constructivists make the point that how they perceive each other, this intersubjective, how they learn from each other and collaborate and create institutions and deem each other friends or not. This is what, and in the case of France and Germany, become much closer, playing a central role to European integration. Not always, and of course there are varieties, but they overall, France and Germany has a very close relationship. But on material power, it shouldn't be this way. It shouldn't be this way. And at any stage, of course, France or Germany could become belligerent to the other side. And yet constructivists challenge realists on this point and say, look, why is this relationship so good? Neighboring countries, hypothetically speaking, in other parts of the world, not so good. So realists argue that they're correct there. But constructivists say, no, not so fast. Whether you have a more conflictual or a friendly relationship or something in between, more a competitive one, you are actually determining it largely or shaping it through your social interaction, how you get to know the other side. So that's by cultural exchanges, diplomatic exchange, and so on and so forth, how we socialize with each other, what we see of what it means to be European in terms of our identity. And identity therefore creates our interest to be friendly or not. On the other side, you have Germany and Russia, Merkel and Putin, and in the image, and this difficult relationship, which has existed. Of course, Germany was two states during the Cold War, if we take the 20th century, East and West Germany, and even today, 30 odd years later, excuse me, between Germany and Russia, still a difficult relationship. They do have material interests. So Merkel and the German state does actually have oil and gas interests from Russia, not just being supplied from parts of the Middle East and elsewhere, but actually Russia is a key supplier of gas, for instance, Gazprom and other important companies that come from the Russian, connected with the Russian state. And Russia sees Germany as an important economic power that it wants collaboration with, wants to work closely with, profit from. Likewise, there are some shared interests in this material approach now, realists or liberals, for, let's say, the situation in the Middle East, migration, other security issues. However, why they have difficult relationships, arguably some elements of trust or lack of, and how both sides perceive each other and refer to each other. And it's the case here that Germany may refer to the Russian state in a particular way, and the Russian state refers to Germany in a particular way, and they have a very, for want of a better term, a very difficult relationship. Again, a relationship that could get better or get worse depending on the context. And again, this is a social interaction that will largely speaking shape it. But it's not axiomatic. It's not determined that Russia and Germany have to have a bad relationship. Like it's not axiomatic that France and Germany have to have a bad relationship. So that's changed for the better. And dare I say that it stays for the better, but not necessarily. And this is the social interaction over time, how it creates our meanings, our social meanings through norms. Now, I'm going to just directly go into how IR, historical role within IR theory, so directly, because constructivism arguably has a number of philosophical antecedents, so key thinkers. Immanuel Kant, who we've come across, Max Weber, there's notions of the social aspects, so how we socialize, which actually shapes our point of view. So contra this rational choice approach, I should say, of, let's say, we have fixed interests, material interests, actually the social aspect is really how we are shaped and do the shaping, as I go into more detail as we go through this sets of slides. Now, the historical role of constructivism. Constructivism, really, it's really into the 1980s and towards the end of the Cold War period, so talking about the IR discipline specifically here, where actually realism, which was the predominant, and arguably possibly still is the predominant theory of international relations, although constructivism is arguably Her Majesty's opposition, if we use British politics terminology, but actually critiquing, look, how things were static. So if realists are always saying that there's an equilibrium, balance of power, and that's why the Soviet Union are always trying to get the power and maintain it the same as the United States, well, we can see that that did not exactly take place. And you see here Gorbachev with perestroika, and glasnost is two political science terms, and forgive my Russian pronunciation, but actually he wanted to change things. So glasnost, this openness, opening up Soviet society, the Soviet system, perestroika, changing, let's say, the economic and political, how are they doing economics, etc., etc. The key point was there was this thinking, both in Moscow and Washington throughout the Cold War, that actually both sides will never change, and that there'll always be fixed, there'll always be this competition for who's the more powerful superpower, etc., etc. And there'll be competition in the various different parts of the world, Africa, Asia, Latin America, regarding which proxy actor one supports. And a tension, but a Cold War tension in the European context, well, actually, there is a figure like Gorbachev, and it's not just an individual, it can be a whole social movement as well that influenced the end of the Cold War, who comes along and says, no, we want the Soviet Union to reform, to change, to actually do things differently. And it was this thinking, changing the norms, what is appropriate, how we should think about ourselves, even the economic system. So Gorbachev was not a revolutionary in that he wanted to be a capitalist society, but he wanted to make communism, if it were possible, to work better, to reform it. He was influenced by, and this is an example here of how we are socialized, influenced by thinking and processes and practices, let's say in Canada, when he went to Canada, or in Spain, with the Social Democrats in Spain, whatever the case might be. So he wanting to reform how the Soviet Union did its own, let's say, ran its own politics and economics and opened things up in terms of civil liberties, and better for the Soviet Union. But again, the Soviet Union, as you remember from a previous lecture, didn't want, in a sense, gave up a certain amount of its own power vis-a-vis Europe and the United States to actually become more part of a particular system or order that it wanted to be part of. Of course, we know subsequently that actually Gorbachev's approach actually led to the downfall of the Soviet Union and the subsequent difficulties in Russia in the 1990s and the rise of Putin. But the key point is these things were not static and fixed. It wasn't that we just need to be the most powerful actor according to realists. No, there's a social dimension. So sometimes even, let's say, giving up power, we can, or using power in a different way is important through this socially constructed aspect. So the end of the Cold War period, really it's where constructivism, and under the umbrella of constructivism, feminism, critical theory, post-structuralism starts to become more powerful. I mean, they're always powerful theories, I should say, but sorry, more seen as relevant. And constructivists in the 1990s, through a range of more mainstream, slightly more positivistic and more critical post-positivists, in a sense, started to become more accepted that constructivism, not so much perhaps feminism or post-structuralism, but constructivists started to become more acceptable to mainstream scholarship whilst having this critical element. And in the critical theory approach, I'll explain the difference between mainstream and critical theory. So what you have to consider here is some of the key assumptions of constructivism, which is important. So our belief systems. And belief systems, by the way, are not just what's in my head. I might have a crazy idea like, I don't know, I'm a giraffe, okay? Fine, I can believe that. You can just think, well, this guy's psychotic, he needs to go and speak to a psychiatrist, etc., etc. It's a socialization practice, our beliefs. So our beliefs come through how we're socialized from childhood onwards, through our family, through our nation state, through school, through the interaction internationally, whatever the case might be. So we believe certain things are the way they are, and that's why they become a social reality. Here I want to just briefly say a difference between two terms. John Searle, S for sugar, E-A-R-L-E. He differentiates between two different concepts. There's one is brute facts and the other is social facts. So you have brute facts and you have social facts. Brute, B-R-U-T-E, in the social construction of reality, John Searle's work. So brute facts and social facts. Brute facts are, and I just want to briefly give you this example. You see this pen? What happened? What happened? Well, in a nutshell, without going to all the intricate aspects of the physics of it, gravity. The pen fell. Okay, that's gravity. Isaac Newton, of course, was the scientist that discovered gravity in a sense, but gravity had always existed. It just needs to be discovered by scientific research. Whatever I believe, whether I believe in gravity or not, it doesn't matter. Gravity exists whether I believe in it or not, like so does atoms, evolution, and various other biological and natural realities. It's what's known as brute facts. However, on the other hand, you have social facts, and also not just John Searle, Anthony Giddens, a great sociologist, and others have written about this. Social facts are, and I gave this example in the first set of slides, take traffic lights. Red means what? It means stop, correct. What does green mean? It means go. In all societies, so it seems, these norms, rules, laws are in place where we can instinctively know that red means stop, if we take it seriously, the rules. Red means stop, green means go, okay? And yellow means slow down or go. But anyway, forget yellow for the moment. Red means stop, green means go. Now, that's a social fact. It didn't come from nature. It came over time. So if we look at it historically, when it came into place, and it's arbitrary why it's these particular color, one color for stop and red for stop and green for go. These are what are known as social facts, and they become our norms, what we consider right, appropriate, and our belief systems are based because they've become institutionalized, laws put in place. These are what are known as social facts. So gravity is a brute fact, traffic lights, as the example, philosophical example, it is a social fact. And a social fact is also, let's say, nation states themselves are constructs, as is, let's say, when you come up with a legal concept that I'll talk about later, refugees, it's a construct. All things are constructed, and over time once we believe in them and we create institutions, belief systems, and reinforce them, these become social facts. If we stop believing in these social facts, then they come to an end. And I will given it doesn't mean just one person, by the way, it needs to be a whole political and social movement and so on. But the example of the Berlin Wall is a relevant example for constructivism that comes later. So again, social and political world, it's inherently intersubjective. So it's not subjective, it's not just what's in my head and what I believe, I'm a giraffe, end of story, no. And it's not some brute fact objective and it's determined and you know, gravity exists whether we believe in it or not, entirely objective. It's what's known as intersubjective. We learn from each other, the social learning. So when you think of the notion of nature versus nurture, it's more nurture. Yes, there's biology, yes, there's geography, yes, there's power politics, but the meaning we give to who we are in terms of a nation state or a non-state actor, the meaning we give, our values, our belief systems, our ethics, this is important. And hence this is where you start to come into the critical element of constructivism, and it's intersubjective. This does not mean, by the way, everyone, that you can just be subjective. No, you as researchers, you as social scientists, you want to strive for objectivity in your work, whatever approach you take, constructivist, post-structuralist, realist. But what it's basically saying to you, liberalism, etc. But what it's basically saying to you here is that it's how we socialize, interact with each other over time, how states and non-states actor create certain meaning, which creates a certain order, and it goes on. So if we consider capitalism as the right order, liberal global order in this sense, and enough actors, important actors in terms of prominent, politically speaking, believe in it, then it becomes a reality. When we stop believing it collectively, then maybe it changes and we have a new global order. So there's always dialogue, there's always discourse, so language and practices and the relationship between language and practices. And we'll see again how constructivism is connected in this way, or as in a big umbrella for feminism or post-structuralism, etc. That actually it's all dependent on human consciousness, ideas, belief systems, and how we interact to create certain institutions, whether we talk about the EU, the African Union, the Arab League, what it means to have a certain identity, to be an Arab, to be European, etc., etc. And how do we simplify this? Each of these things create, and then we have multiple identities, of course, but it's through this human activity and how we create our institutions, our structures, economic, social, environmental, and it can only be created through this interaction, social interaction, until it becomes a social structure. But we are making and shaping the social structure, and we can continue it in a certain way, we can change it, etc., etc. And a few examples. So whether we talk about nation states, whether we talk about alliances, I gave the example again at the beginning between France and Germany. Why is it, for example, Brazil and Argentina that historically had difficult relationships, still don't have maybe the best relationship, but have better relations? You have to look at historical context. Again, it's not just the fact of material wealth or geography or economics, because it would say that these two countries perhaps should have good relations or bad relations. So Germany and France shouldn't necessarily have good relations, but how they've been socialized, particularly the identity fact of of what the Second World War meant, for example, for both sides, particularly for Germany, what it meant and what we want and what we don't want. Who are we and what do we want? What it becomes our interest. It becomes in our interest, if we are German, to actually shape a European unity and integration, and that we're not all powerful, and we don't repeat the horrors of the Second World War, etc., etc. And again, I could talk much more about this, but it's just to get you to think about the socialization process. All institutions have been created through this social interaction, and according to the Constructivists, of course. And again, one has to be historically, culturally, and politically sensitive. So understand how, let's say, institutions have evolved over time, why we have a particular social and political economic order, and how and in what way one can change it. That's also, by the way, where constructivism or critical theory becomes part of the constructivist umbrella, because critical theory thinks about, we have to understand where power comes from, what it means, etc., and how we can harness it to change it normatively. How should we change it? Should, then we bring in ethics, to create a more progressive and possibly emancipatory global order, etc., etc. That's critical theory, but there are linkages there with constructivism. So human interaction in a social world, and this is all of international relations. Any issue area we think about, again, political economy, international security, human rights, humanitarian intervention, etc. Even notions something horrible like racism, it's a social construct. It's not based on biology. Biology, there's a tiny, 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 tiny difference in terms of pigmentation of skin color. That's the difference, not in any genetic way. It's this social construct and the power that the European powers originally in the 18th, 19th century, what have you, saying, we, white, European, civilized, you bad, you backward, etc., etc. And race became, as we know, in the horrors of the 20th century, in the rise of fascism in Europe and Asia, and of course Nazism, how it was used in a horrible way against groups of people. It's a construct, race, and it's to keep certain actors in a more powerful position than others. That's where, of course, we can look at post-structuralism and post-colonialism. But again, constructivism has this broad umbrella that incorporates some of that in terms of the social interaction. So again, human meaning and the action we give to it is through it. Again, if I consider you a friend or an enemy, I'm going to relate differently to you, or a competition somewhere in between, as not just constructivists, but also the English school have spoken about. And this is important in terms of how issues are developed. Constructivists acknowledge this continuity, and of course there's continuity because as aspects become institutionalized, the Cold War, there was a lot of continuity in the Cold War from 1947 to 1991. But they also, unlike realists, to contra-realists, they say, well, actually, this single so-called objective reality that realists, classical and neo-realists go on about, is a bit of a myth. Yes, there's this aspect that a realist world we can live in, but it's one type of reality. There are different types of reality. And actually, it depends where in the world. For example, in some parts of the world, the Middle East, so it's maybe you might say in Central Africa or the Middle East, or parts of South Asia, whatever the case might be, you might say, well, it's a very much a realist way that these state actors are operating. And then you think of let's say, it's not always been the case, in Europe and certain other parts of the world where aspects be much more these regions have become much more institutionalized, much more integration, friendly relations. Well, you can see that it's not the same in all parts of the world. It changes depending on where you go. So constructivists are sensitive to this. It's not some single social objective reality. Second one, social dimensions. We have to bring in norms, what we consider, what are our expectations, what we consider of appropriate, of what our identity is and how our identity shapes our interests, and the rules that come around it, the formalization of the norms, so that the laws that come into place, the rules, and then language, how we use language, and how I refer to you as a friend, I refer to you as a terrorist, I refer to you to whatever. Then if enough people believe me and we create institutions, then I create a war against terror, or I create a war against drugs, whatever the case might be. So language can be used for good or ill in this way. And there's always a relationship between material and ideational factors. So the material factor of being a large country is one thing. The meaning we give to that material fact of what it means to be Germany, to have a particular GDP, military, etc., geographical entity, etc. We have to consider that the meaning we give what it means to be German or Nigerian, or even a non-state actor like Amnesty International. Amnesty International's meaning and purpose and objective is different than it would be to a militant group that uses violence. Social dimensions. And there's a relationship always between the ideas and material factors in a sense. It's not one or the other. And again, through our interaction, we create realities, we create the norms and the rules. So the Cold War was not something that was there from the beginning. There were choices made from both sides at the beginning of the Cold War. From the US side, when Truman became president and Stalin was obviously General Secretary of the Soviet Union, these two leaders, but the people around them, there were a whole host of factors. And one takes a historiographical approach and tries to understand it. Was it more the US's fault? Was it more the Soviet Union's fault? Was it other factors? Well, the point was, and that's obviously a debate that historians or political scientists might have, but the point was this interaction wasn't axiomatic they were going to be enemies. They could have been friends. It just depended on a whole host of factors and choices that were made by certain actors, how I perceive you. So my perception of you is, again, my perception becomes the reality. If I perceive you in a particular way and enough people believe it, then it becomes objective. So if I perceive you as good and then you do as well, it becomes, largely speaking, something positive. However, as I said when I was critiquing realism with using constructivism here, it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. If I say, for example, that you're bad or I shouldn't trust you, etc., to use this case, to be, let's say, not so trusting, to use this realist thinking, then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because we'll both consider each other, don't trust each other, which creates a particular tension in a particular global order, which may lead to conflict or economic protectionism, whatever the case might be. And this is all under the realms of different, basically, realities that constructivism allows for. So it allows for more possibilities than realism in this sense. So there's a historical and social construct. It's not, and again, this nature-nurture argument, biology versus environment, it's more the environment. It's not ignoring. Social constructivists are not saying it's ideas all the way down. I mean, maybe a particular type of post-structuralist thought might make that argument, but most constructivists, including post-structuralists, acknowledge that there is some aspect of nature. Of course, there is nature. There is, for constructivists, there is geography, there's all these different material realities, but it's the meaning we give to it. And so it's not inevitable, contra classical realists, that human nature being selfish. It just depends how one is socialized, the environment, the cultural context. In some cultural contexts, actually, the individual is actually submerged by a more communitarian, collectivist mindset, or let's say, whether it's ethnic, tribal, whatever the case might be. The point being, it's not all about the individual getting his or her interest. The interest can be for the group, whatever. So it's not inevitable that it's human nature. That's something that has been constructed according to constructivists, and so on and so forth. And it's not inevitable that we don't trust and we come to conflict. Not inevitable, but of course it does happen. And constructivists say that's because of this lack of trust, etc., etc. So there's always a historical and social context. So the meanings, the social meanings we give to it, how I perceive you and how you perceive me, intersubjective. So they're not always fixed. I might perceive you, and this is also the English school, another prominent school that you should think about, that has linkages with constructivism. If I perceive you as a friend, a competitor, or an enemy, then our relationship will unfold in different ways. Again, two-state actors, France and Germany, perceive each other in one way, but maybe Germany perceives another country in a much more negative light, and that interaction is going to evolve over time. Likewise, non-state actors and their role. What do we see the role of a major company like Amazon? Is it a friend to? It depends. Is it an enemy? It depends on who's making the point, which group of people, which environmental group, which labour standards group, whatever the case, trade union, that how they see a particular group. It's this social interaction, and then this is how they create a better or worse relationship between these different stakeholders in a society or within international relations, more broadly, state and non-state actors. So it doesn't take for granted, it denaturalizes, and it says, well, look, how have things come this way? Where do they come from? It's not axiomatic that these two countries or these two actors have always necessarily had a bad relationship. It could be different, and we have to understand that historically, where it's come from. Can we change it? So Gorbachev, again, to use him as the example, was it axiomatic that the Soviet Union and the United States would always be in conflict? Well, obviously, Gorbachev looked at the Soviet history, looked at his own role in it, and made a choice, for better or worse. I mean, I could happily give a personal opinion on it, but the point I want to say is that created a different global order due, because of being a prominent actor, to his own actions. So as soon as we deconstruct and challenge certain aspects of how things have, where they've come from, try to understand them, we can potentially also, for the future, change a particular way of doing things. So it doesn't just take things for granted and say it's all about power politics. It's how powerful the state actor is if you're a realist, or also the roles of non-state actors if you're a liberal. No, it starts to deconstruct and challenge it. So power. Now power so sometimes constructivists, this large umbrella of constructivism, and within constructivism, let's say feminist thinking, post-structuralist, post-colonial, etc., critical theory, oh well, power, and particularly for constructivists, oh well, it's realist critique power and saying you don't understand what power is because it's material interests, etc. No, power is also, let's say, if you can get an act to do what it would not otherwise do. Okay, a major liberal thinker like Joseph Nye has made that point, but it's also producing, this is where constructivism comes in, the identities, the meanings that we give to things. So the identity, if I perceive you, and I create the interest. So if I perceive you as someone I'm close to, let's say my mother or my brother or some other family member, I will, let's say, the meaning I give to that and what I give to you is different than perhaps it would be with another person. And the point is that actually the power and how I can get what I want or get it from others varies depending on who I'm interacting with, and so on and so forth. So again, German power could be, in this sense, how it has more integration within Europe. And yes, Germany maybe benefits by being part of the euro monetary aspects, economic aspects. So that's a materialist, a liberal aspect here as well, or realist. But basically, Germany also benefits through its integration, through its identity of what it means to be a peaceful European actor, etc., etc. And this meaning helps shape what Germany's role is and how it's part of something larger than itself, rather than being the dominant hegemonic actor. Although, of course, Germany is going in a certain direction, and we will see how Europe evolves in that sense. But Germany, broadly speaking, in the last, well, post-Second World War context even, has wanted to play an important role, but also to be part of something bigger than itself. So that would challenge, again, realist premises. But Germany is powerful in its own right. So constructivism, again, consciousness, beliefs, ideas, mindsets. This is also a big part. What we believe collectively, how we create it, will help shape what it is. And that's why ideas are not separate to material reality. There's a relationship, an interconnection, a dialectical relationship, to use critical theory language, of what shapes world politics. This is important. And our mental maps in our minds, but again, not just individual psychology, where let's say some neo-realists talk about, but actually, again, how we've been shaped through our interaction with others. So learning language, for example, that this is Wittgenstein, the great Anglo-Austrian thinker. Actually, it's always a social process. It's not, it can't just be in our head. So learning the English language, or German, or Arabic, or Hebrew, or Mandarin, or Italian, whatever the case might be, Swahili, Portuguese, you learn it as a child and it becomes part of your system, ingrained in your system over time. It's not just in your head. There's an environmental aspect to it, environment, I should say. And so knowledge, these symbols, and what a flag means. An example I always give is, and we now know with Brexit, the UK leaving the European Union. And the fact about that is, one thing from a constructivist point of view that we have to consider is, and I give an example here, an example I once gave to a previous foreign secretary, so a foreign minister at a public talk, 2014, David Miliband is the person's name. Basically, the point I made to him was in this public forum that actually you go to Westminster and you can always see the UK, the British flag, but you can never see a European Union flag. Whereas if you go to other European capitals, Berlin, Paris, Warsaw, Rome, Lisbon, etc., you can see both a national flag and a European Union flag. That's identity. These symbols, what it means to be both, let's say, British and European, which is not a contradiction for me at least, but for some it is. Notions of sovereignty and independence comes into the equation. And of course, a lot of Brits actually are very, very disappointed about Brexit. But nonetheless, the point I want to make here is, this is an example, a construct of how some are skeptical of what it means to be European, part of a European, in the institutions, the European Union, and therefore in Westminster, where you have Parliament, it was very difficult to see an EU flag, whereas in a country which is more pro-EU, generalization, Paris, Berlin, Rome, Warsaw, you can easily see both flags. So you see, this is how things are constructed and made to give certain meaning over time. And the world is therefore, there's always a social context, and also with the material factors and actors, so structure and agency. So structure, as you may recall, social, political, economic structures that are made over time, and they're part of it, and agents who have certain intentions, objectives, purposes, and they are always, according to major sociologists, especially of the last 40 years, 50 years, Anthony Giddens, Pierre Bourdieu, Roy Bhaskar, Margaret Archer, etc. But they are also making and remaking the social structure. And again, so Harry Truman and Stalin at the beginning of the Cold War created a structure which was the Cold War. I give only two individuals. It's more complicated than that. And subsequent presidents and general secretaries, America, Soviet Union, reproduced, refined, made this structure of the Cold War a social reality. And then in the 1980s, mid-1980s onwards, with Gorbachev and Reagan, I just emphasize the political actors, the leaders, it's more than just these two figures. They actually changed the structure through their interaction, and Gorbachev accepting differences and change, and the structure itself was changed. And then eventually there was no Cold War social structure anymore. But a brief thing of how we can be eclectic and find connections between logic, so a realist and constructivist. So although there's differences, let's find a brief connection. So logic of consequences is a more realist principle, a concept in terms of, look, you always think whenever you take an action as a state actor, what are the costs and benefits? What can I do to achieve my outcome for state A? So if I'm Ethiopia or Eritrea, to achieve it over the other, how can I achieve it in the zero-sum thinking? And logic of consequences therefore thinks, what's the result? What can I get from that? Utilitarian thinking in this way. Whereas constructivists think about the identity and norms and what's the appropriate way of acting in a certain context. So for logic of appropriateness, which is a more constructivist, Martha Finmore and Catherine Sekinga, important thinkers here, they think about norms and rules. What's appropriate? What's legitimate? How do I perceive myself, and therefore what's right? I gave the example, would it be, in a previous presentation, would it be appropriate for the United States to invade Barbados? Maybe an exceptional case, that could happen, exceptional, but not really. And therefore, this is where logic of appropriateness is an important part of it. Michael Barnett from your chapter also has written in detail about this. However, they're not always in competition. In the first Gulf War, referred to 1990-91, George H.W. Bush's administration, actually So there was a material interest for George H.W. Bush, which is that the Iraq government under Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and so an important percentage of oil was under the control of Saddam Hussein at that stage. There's a whole historical context which I can go into more detail about when I look at international security, that set of slides when we would get there. But for now, I just want to make the point there was a material interest, an economic interest of stopping Saddam Hussein and Iraq having too much control of oil resources. There was a way of getting, which George H.W. Bush did more successfully than his son in terms of the 2003 Iraq War, getting a coalition of the willing. So liberal notions here of getting Arab and European states to actually support, not necessarily maybe so much militarily speaking, because the US is a very powerful military actor, so only a few actors like the UK and others supported, but basically getting some financial support, but also diplomatic support, and therefore made it legitimate and legitimized the action. And here is what is appropriate. Is it appropriate for a dictator, now we're going to use Bush's language, to actually, and international law here, I will use that language too, is it appropriate for a leader to invade another country? There's the notion of sovereignty. Sovereignty is a social construct made over time where we take it for granted, and it becomes a habit until it's changed again, if it's changed again. And so is it appropriate to invade another country? No. What does that mean? What's appropriate? Well, it's appropriate to have international relations and to respect the sovereignty, territorial integrity of another nation state. So Kuwait's territorial integrity had been gone against. Likewise, is the US a legitimate actor? Yes, it's doing it it's following certain rules, norms of international law. So here, it was a benefit, materially speaking, for the United States, but it was also appropriate and hence seen as legitimate action, also in the UN Security Council and so on and so forth. And therefore, there's a relationship here, so an analytical eclecticism that you can see between these two approaches. International norms. Many different ways of defining norms, but here just briefly for international relations, it's shared expectations about what's appropriate. And it's not, behavior is very important here, but it's also like how I identify in terms of my identity and what I construct of what my interest is. And it becomes, in this case, international community or international society, to use an English school or constructivist term, what that is and who we are and what therefore our interests become. And when norms shift, then arguably it's going to change how the states interact with one another and therefore their behavior. And an example. So here I've got a number of examples. Sovereignty. Sovereignty is something that was constructed. Remember I spoke about the treaties of Westphalia 1648 and the Westphalian system that we talk about when we talk about IR. It was not axiomatic that policies, political communities, and subsequently now nation states, this notion of sovereignty that we take for granted, especially in the post-Second World War context of what it means that Hungary has its sovereignty or in whatever country I want to say, South Africa, India, Bolivia has its sovereignty. This is something that was constructed and made and remade over time, like colonialism. Colonialism of the European, particularly European, not just European, but let's focus particularly on the European empires, Britain, France, previous to that, maybe the Dutch, previous to that, the Spanish and Portuguese, and other colonial powers we could bring in. Each of these, let's say, created, so the Spanish and the Portuguese in the 15th century onwards, created a notion of what a hierarchy. And then we know with the Dutch subsequently, and then the French and the British going into the 18th, 19th, early 20th century, created a meaning and a hierarchy in the world, and created an order and what it means that to have direct control of a certain aspect. That's of course you get also into here when it can be indirect and you think of empire, but colonialism creating certain structures where one group is dominant over another. And we know with European empires this was part of their actions in terms of re-establishing it, but it was a way of saying it. And then this is where you get into race. We are white, we're European, it's post-colonial thinking, and we have to critique this mindset even today, and how some elites in developing countries have internalized some of this mindset of let's say, hierarchy and so on. Not so much with race, but in some other areas. But colonialism itself was also premised on race and how there's hierarchy and how there's one group or one thing is more civilized and the other is barbaric. This is where, and we could tie it in some ways with slavery. And again, as I emphasize and re-emphasize and re-emphasize, race and racism, it's a social construct. It doesn't come from biology. And yet, once it's believed, it created great, and my own point now, obvious point you might say, is it created great evil in the world. And slavery was a result of it. European empires and the Atlantic slave trade, moving across different parts from across the Atlantic, the slave trade, that was a social construct based on the idea that whites are superior to blacks, which, as we know, and I'm going to say it very directly, is nonsense. But because it was believed and there was institutions in place and economic relations, this became a reality. And of course, over time, by the 19th century, started to be deconstructed and challenged. And eventually, slavery came to an end. But still, there's informal hierarchies and racism, horrible racism, which still exists today until this moment. A landmine treaty. In the 1990s, important middle-ranking countries like Canada, Australia, and the roles of certain individuals and celebrities like Princess Diana, the end of a conflict, landmines explode and take people's legs off, etc., etc. Eventually, there was an agreement constructed and made by different state actors and agreed upon, helped through the role of non-state actors, as I've referred to as well, and different social and non-governmental organizations, social movements also played a role here, but created a landmine treaty protecting people in a post-conflict situation. Likewise, humanitarian intervention, from the second set of slides, responsibility to protect. That is something that was constructed in the last 15, 20 years to actually, although humanitarian intervention actually, I should say, forgive me, has got hundreds of years to it, but I'm specifically referring now to responsibility to protect if a crime against humanity or genocide is taking place. That was something that was thought about, perceived, and made and constructed over time. So to refer to an article of a major mainstream constructivist scholar, i.e. Alexander Wendt, from his article International Organization, from the journal International Organization, and this is the name of the article, Anarchy is What States Make of It, the Social Construction of Power Politics. So anarchy, in this article, what Wendt is basically arguing is, yes, it's true that, so let's accept, this is what makes a more mainstream constructivist rather than a critical one, because he accepts a number of the realist premises rather than trying to deconstruct or challenge it in a more post-structuralist way. We accept that states are powerful, we accept that they're central to international politics, but this anarchical system, it's not axiomatic that we're going to lead to conflict. It depends on how we interact with one another, according to Alex Wendt. It depends on how we shape and we perceive each other and how we relate to each other, language, norms, discourse, language and practices, and the norms that help socialize and shape us. And therefore, we can, again, going back to social media, we can be friends, we can be competitors, or we can be enemies. It just depends. And there's some human agency here. And just to say a difference between more mainstream and critical constructivists, mainstream constructivists put more of an emphasis on norms, and critical constructivists put more emphasis on discourse. So how language and practices reinforce it. If I refer to you as a terrorist and eventually I create institutions and so on and so forth, and you are believed to be what I've described you as, so the language and practice reinforce each other, that's, and we have to critique and deconstruct it, that would be a more critical constructivist approach. So, constructing national interests. So looking at this, and we'll look at this in more detail when we look at foreign policy analysis, but how does a state, okay, we could also talk about non-states knowing its interests, but I refer particularly to states here. How does a state know what it wants? You don't always know. Realists talk about the subjective material reality. Well, hang on a second. It just depends. Depends on how I interact with you. Depends on how I see you. You having a nuclear weapon, it depends. Are you a friend? Are you an enemy? It really doesn't. It just depends on the context, historical, cultural, political. And our interpretation is always guided by interpretation, like law is. Always interpretation. What does it mean by national interest? So is it to be powerful? We're Germany. We want to be the hegemonic, materialistically speaking, the hegemonic power of Europe. Well, maybe it's more in our interest of what our national interest, to be more European, to have more European integration. And shared language, flags that I referred to before, different ideas that you see in the media and elsewhere, help shape purpose, meaning for what we do and what represents us as a state or non-state actor. And we need to be consistent. If I'm talking about promoting human rights and democracy in a certain region, and clearly something like that's not taking place, then my legitimacy is going to be understandably questioned. So, it is a theory of international relations. I should make this very clear. But the key point is, from what I mean from this particular slide is it's a large umbrella constructivism, because we're talking about ontology, so what the meaning is. And we're talking about how things are created through social relations, so social meaning, social ontology. Unlike this fixed rationalistic approach, which is actually we have fixed interest like realists talk about. No, it's actually, we look at this socialization process as front and center. And the reason, again, what I want to say here is it's a large umbrella constructivism, which feminism, post-structuralism, post-colonial, critical theory comes under, because we're looking at how social meaning creates particular orders and so on, and interactions. So realist power politics is one scenario, as been referred. Alex Vent and others have spoken about. Reality is a social, not an objective fact. It's not a brute fact. If you remember my example from gravity, it's not a brute fact, it's a social fact. And it doesn't mean that these social facts don't become objective. So it is objective to talk about, in this sense, traffic lights having some objectivity, with red meaning stop, green meaning go. And that's objective, but it's not something that's come from nature. And so it can be changed. So the fall of the Soviet Union, Gorbachev's role in that, and solidarity in Poland, and other social movements in different parts of East Europe, Central East Europe and elsewhere, leading to the peaceful fall of the Soviet Union and Gorbachev's role in that, and the Berlin Wall. I mean, a wall is just a wall, arguably. But what's the meaning given to it? A wall is to divide between East and West, between East Germany and West Germany. West Germany representing capitalist liberal ideology, East Germany representing communist ideology, etc., constructivism. And the meaning that was given from 1961 to the end to the downfall, to the end of the Berlin Wall, coming down, this was constructed and made and remade over time. And so the idea of a soldier keeping a gun, stopping East Europeans leaving, and at the end, the wall itself, when people stop believing in their own, let's say, government, in their own situation, wanting to move, in some cases to leave, and being able to, really, the dying days of the Berlin Wall, certain actors, political, social, and I'm referring now to East Germany, wanting to move and to go in certain ways, and eventually the Berlin Wall came tumbling down, so to speak. And you remember the famous images and so on and so forth. The point being that the Berlin Wall was something that was made, constructed, refined, was there for a long period of time, 30 years, what have you, around just under, what have you. And then it was eventually demolished because a certain amount of political actors stopped believing in it, and also social actors. And then we don't have the wall anymore. So here, this image. And you can see an image, famous images. Really, this was really, in a sense, telling us that the Cold War is coming to an end. There can be peaceful relations directly between East and West. Moving forward, at least hypothetically speaking, at that time period, and a type of triumphalism from the West, for better or worse. But the key point was these different actors in East and West, Germany now I'm referring to, wanted to have this connection and to be together again. Now, we're not going to go into German reunification and how that was led by Kohl and so on, because that's a long description. But the point being, for constructivists, this is just a wall. The wall, its meaning, it doesn't necessarily have to be dangerous. Obviously, you're in the Berlin Wall from 1961 onwards, and you're from East Germany, you want to go into the West. It's dangerous. It's dangerous for you to leave because you can be shot at, literally. Okay? And so the meaning of the wall and the people around it, in this case soldiers, the guards, who were, of course, the East German government of the day, was instigating this, was directing this with the support of the Soviet Union, meant that the meaning given to it was for what? For some of the East Germans. Well, for some of them, it was actually, we want to leave because we want our freedoms. We don't have freedoms here, we want it elsewhere. Again, I don't want to simplify about Cold War ideology and the pros and cons, but for some East Germans who wanted to leave, and literally either were shot dead or managed to get over the wall, it was literally like that, escaping for their freedom. And that was the meaning they had given, and that was the constructivist element again here. And the wall comes, people stopped believing in the Cold War, enough political and social actors stopped believing it. Gorbachev saying, don't use violence in Central East Europe, don't shoot. The peaceful resolution of the Cold War in a surprising way, positive way in that sense that it was peaceful, and the Berlin Wall coming to an end. So again, the meaning that was given to this wall is different that's given to other walls. Now, second case study example that I can give is negotiations with Iran and its nuclear program. And of course, Trump leaving it in May 8th, 2018. But this is what eventually was signed between the P5 countries, as you know, the Security Council, China, France, Russia, the UK, and the USA, plus Germany, and plus the European Union is independent of its own foreign ministry and so on. You've got the European Union representative and the Iranian representative. And the interesting thing here, P5 plus one, so the permanent 5 plus Germany, had negotiated. So at the time, of course, as you may recall, by when eventually was agreement reached, July 2015, the Obama administration in the United States, and the far right, you see John Kerry, and this was a big legacy of the Obama administration. Now, where is and then the Trump administration withdrawing in May 8th, 2018, and Trump, of course, against any trying to go against Obama's legacy in Iran, Cuba, elsewhere, but also it was a bad deal according to Trump, etc., etc. But the key point I want to say is this: why is it? So it's nuclear weapons we're talking about. Each of these countries, so the permanent 5 I'm referring to, not Germany, but each of the 5 P5, they have nuclear weapons. In the case of the US and Russia, many nuclear weapons. Iran has no nuclear weapons up to this point and doesn't. Now, was it seeking to them? That's an open-ended question. And that's a long discussion of Middle Eastern politics. But the point is, a nuclear weapon is a nuclear weapon. It's potentially very dangerous, destructive, etc., etc. Why is it that, let's say, 2 countries that are neighbours or very close by, UK and France, which have between them many, many weapons? Don't quote me on this, but let's say France has approximately 120 to 140, the UK 130 to 150 nuclear weapons. It's something like this. Don't quote me exactly. The point being, why is it that these 2 are not afraid? Because the UK should be very afraid of France because of all these nuclear weapons, which can do horrible destruction, destroy humanity, or destroy the UK, environmental destruction, etc., etc. And France should be very, very scared of the UK. No. Why? Because they perceive each other, the intersubjective aspect, as friends, as having dialogue. Okay, Brexit hasn't necessarily made it easier, but you get the point. There's a perception and there's a trust, so on and so forth. Whereas Iran, which doesn't have a nuclear weapon, nonetheless, there's a realist argument for its power within the Middle East, but here for it's perceived as not so trustworthy from these sides. And so if you instigate it, they're not seen as such a friend to these countries, supposedly, according to this constructivist rationale. And therefore it instigates. So it's not the fact of a nuclear weapon itself, the material object, it's the meaning that's given to it and the meaning in particular given to which actor has the nuclear weapon and what that actor would do, whether you trust it, whether you see that actor as a friend or an enemy, as a competitor. And so it was important, according to the P5 plus 1, that Iran don't get nuclear weapons. That was agreed upon unanimously. And that's why you have this joint comprehensive plan of action and eventually agreed between all the parties in this picture, July 2015. And this was important. But again, the nuclear weapon, hypothetically speaking, when one talks about, let's say, disarmament, nuclear disarmament, all of these countries, the US, the UK, Russia, going across to France and China, why should they have nuclear weapons? Now, there's also power politics to this, of course, and history, but actually this trust aspect plays an important role. They have it, and that they don't want it to be spread. And this is because of the dangers of nuclear weapons, but also what's appropriate, what we deem right, etc. And of course, questions of who we deem as a friend or not. Okay, so again, to use the Alex Vence term, anarchy is what states make of it. So again, states have a choice as agency. There's choice here. It's not. It doesn't dictate this intersubjectivity. So you can have a good relationship or a more peaceful relationship or more conflictual relationship. It just depends. Okay, and that's a key aspect of constructivism. It's agnostic in a sense. It just depends on how these different actors create and recreate these structures and interact with one another. And there can also be a transformative element for better or worse, of course, because it can be for worse, as we've seen, notions of slavery or anti-Semitism or homophobia. It can be used in a negative sense. But arguably, this is an arguable point, but I would argue for this, let's say the European Union has a normative element to it, a positive element in and of itself. It can do that. States can pool resources and create something that goes beyond just the state interest and actually do something where the 450 million peoples of the EU can actually benefit through many different levels of governance and analysis. So the key point here is that anarchy is there's human consciousness. For better or worse, we can change things in one direction or the other. And so norms can play a role on international politics. The norms of the US or France or Iran or Israel or Japan, and how it impacts itself and how it with others, okay? And it can also be civil society actors, but also international norms can impact on national politics. So when you see international treaties that are signed, whether it's, let's say, against genocide or against slavery, as two obvious examples, but even, let's say, signing up to various conventions which are for political and civil rights, negative liberties, or economic, social, cultural rights. When a country, and you might say a country like Saudi Arabia, which has poor human rights records, signs up to it, that can potentially at least play a socializing role on national politics. And why is it, let's say, eventually that something like slavery is outlawed over time? That's also because of actors having an international component and impacting on others. An example, of course, that one often thinks about towards the end of the Cold War is South Africa. The white apartheid regime that was in control, but many actors, civil society actors in some states like Norway as an example, but many civil society anti-apartheid actors supporting the African National Congress led by the very charismatic and brilliant Nelson Mandela, and over time socialized the situation where there was a big transnational actors supporting liberation in South Africa, to use a term like that. And eventually there was an agreement between the white apartheid regime led by de Klerk at the end of the Cold War and Mandela, and a peaceful transition. But of that horrible racism that had taken place in South Africa, didn't finish overnight, but the international norms, different social actors helped shape and socialize and play a role on the evolution of South African society, and then an eventual liberal democracy that evolved when Mandela became president in 1994. And I could say much more about South Africa, good, the bad, the everything, but basically that's just to show how the international component can also play a role on the national and vice versa. So this discursive construction, and this is what takes us next term in foreign policy analysis, securitization theory, how you articulate the threat and it becomes believed. That becomes one thing. And post-structuralist, so that's the English school, but also the Copenhagen school in securitization, security theory. That comes next semester. But basically, post-structuralism, so constructivism, big umbrella, remember post-structuralism, a part of it. If I say you're a threat, so I say you're dangerous, I say you're a terrorist, you're this, and enough people believe in it, then you become a threat. And over time, I can say you're more and more threat. So China, for example, yes, it's a growing, or it is a powerful country in and of itself, not just growing, economically, politically, militarily speaking, geographically. But in more recent times, and not just the Trump administration, so the US, but the UK, other countries in Europe and elsewhere have started, Australia, have started to say, oh, how dangerous China is. Less so 5 years ago. Now, there are a whole host of reasons why they do that, but the more you say that China's bad, China this, China that, and again, we could get to the nitty-gritty of it, analytically speaking, but eventually, if enough different state actors and non-state actors believe that, then China will be interacted with in a different way. Different to how, let's say, it was interacted with 5 years ago, because the threats become our perceptions. And we often, when we think of now China's dangerous, talking about Western-centric way now, China is dangerous. So because we believe that, it becomes a reality, and it becomes a more difficult relationship. Protectionism that's taken place between the US and China, but more difficult over security issues than the question of 5G, human rights. This becomes much more of an issue. So key concepts. I've already spoken in detail about each one, but how things are socially constructed, the social facts. So we create our meaning through our language, through our practices, through our interaction, and that things they're not a brute fact, they don't come from nature, but they are constantly has actors interacting, creating a social structure, creating it, reproducing it, refining it, and then changing it. Intersubjectivity, we learn from each other. There's a cultural aspect, environmental factor, and we are constantly learning and therefore making these structures through this intersubjectivity. So it's knowledge sharing, and what that means and how we perceive each other from that. Identity creates interest, and there's a relationship between identity and interest. But what it means for me to be a particular individual, I could go through a whole host of things of what my identity is personally, but also in a social context. What it means to be, let's say, what an identity for Amnesty International is, as opposed to ISIS in the Middle East. Different identity and therefore different interests of what Amnesty International, a non-state actor, wants to achieve, as opposed to ISIS, a very different type of actor, very different type of entity, which creates interest. And norms of what we consider appropriate, what we deem appropriate in terms of who we are, again connected with identity, and what is considered appropriate in terms of our actions, behavior, and meaning. And meaning is for everything, everywhere, so to speak, but there's a social meaning that we give to things, and it's the meaning that constructs and makes our reality. So the meaning we give to a wall, let's say a wall here in London where I'm recording this particular lecture, or a wall in Berlin during the Cold War, it depends on the different actors involved and so on and so forth. So these are the key concepts I want you to think about, be aware of. Seminal works I put here. More mainstream constructivists would be considered the first three, and the more critical constructivists is the last one, Richard Jackson. But Alexander Wendt, his work, Social Theory of International Politics, is a seminal text, the Cambridge University Press. It's a social theory of international politics, really a response to Kenneth Waltz's international theory of politics, a direct response, taking on realism on its own terms, bringing in constructivism and also more critical elements, but also, let's say, taking it on its own terms and doing it, and so it's a very important constructivist text. Martha Finmore's National Interests in International Society. When I was talking about norms in national shaping international and vice versa, this is in a sense how international society can play a role in shaping what it means for a national interest for a nation state. So the relationship between the two. So norms is a very important aspect of Martha Finmore's work. Peter Katzenstein, this work, The Culture of National Security, Norms and Identity and World Politics. What Katzenstein and his collaborators try to do in this book is say, okay, realists, we're going to take you on your own terms. You're all about security, fine. We're going to refer to security in this book, but we're going to show how security can be expanded upon, etc. And we're going to bring in the socialization, norms, identity, and show actually how constructivists can do as good as, if not more effective job in understanding what security is, how interests are created in terms of security, etc., etc. And then final one, Richard Jackson's work, Writing the War on Terrorism, a critical constructivist post-structuralist approach and critical theory approach, language, politics and counterterrorism. It's a critique of the Bush administration and other administrations, particularly the Bush administration, how the Bush administration constructed the social reality, which is 9/11, living in a post-9/11 world, how the Twin Towers, the meaning that was given to that, etc., etc. Richard Jackson looks at, so discourse analysis, looked at how language was used, how it created certain institutions, and it relates, so the Department of Homeland Security and a global war on terror, and therefore created the possibility, so not why, the way positivists, realists and others might talk about why something happened, but how is it possible? It was possible, and this is the difference between positivism, why sort of questions, and how possible, both more post-positivist, constructivist, feminist, critical theory, etc. How was it possible that the Bush administration managed to achieve their particular approach and create a global war on terror, or you had the acts of 9/11 and the construction of language and identity and news items showing the Twin Tower attacks time and time again. And Richard Jackson looks at how language and text, through analysing text and so on, the meaning of certain words, how it created certain practices and the relationship between language and practices, and he critiques it and deconstructs it and makes the point that actually it created a more conflictual world order rather than something better. So, social construction of refugees. Who is a refugee? Well, historically in international law, it did not exist. This notions, concepts, so it had to become into being through language, through practices, through norms, and really, it's really not until the First World War that states started to give this status of refugees and hence certain rights, human rights, what have you. And again, historically, if you were white, European, male even, etc., you're in a much more advantageous position than someone not that. So really, it's really only, so when, let's say, historic 19th century, you would help out, well, you'd help out if you were Christian Europe, you'd help out those, let's say, you felt an affinity with. Today, post-Second World War, what it means by refugees, international humanitarian law, it's universal. It's not just the colour of your skin or this or that, or whether you're Christian or whatever religion that one might be. No, it's universal. The definition was modified, so it's not just a European-centric approach. And that's how refugee and what it means to be a refugee and the status under international law expanded over time. And so the meaning of 9/11, well, I've already referred to Richard Jackson's work in the 2 slides ago. But again, what would a realist say about this? Well, they would say it's state-centric. So Al-Qaeda, a transnational actor, flying a plane, or 2 planes, I should say, into the Twin Tower attacks, and also in Washington, going in the direction of the Pentagon, hitting the parts of the Pentagon and Pennsylvania. Hitting the World Trade Organization. Well, according to realists, and that's of course got very symbolic value, it's also got economic points, etc., etc. But the point is, hitting Twin Tower attacks, for realists it would say, what do we need to do? It's a transnational actor trying to get a lot of attention, trying to influence in certain ways. But reality is, realism now, we need to look at where this transnational, because remember, state actors are front and center, state actors front and center. What sort of meaning do we give? Well, we have to think, well, Al-Qaeda was harbored really from 1996 to 2001 in Afghanistan by the Taliban. Therefore, there's a reason to attack this country, to intervene in this country, subsequently Operation Enduring Freedom, and that's it, a limited war with another state and finding the key leaders of Al-Qaeda. That's a realist premise. A constructivist premise brings in ideas, norms, belief systems, and actually attacking the Twin Tower attacks. Twin Tower attacks, of course, horrible, 3,000 people dying, but the meaning given by political actors, by the Bush administration, Blair in the UK, in Russia, in China, and the media that was given, the media, let's say, images, and how, let's say, different politicians gave into it, fed into the sense that it's an existential threat. And enough people started to believe in it, and it constructed a particular way of approaching it, which was militaristic, subsequently Afghanistan, Iraq wars, etc., a global war on terror, GWOT. So there's a constructivist meaning changed on 9/11. Now, you might be a skeptic about why it changed, and that there was self-interest for a country, etc. Fair enough. But the point is, the meaning changed, and that was what was constructed by these political actors and so on. So what I want you to do is, and I've already given you a certain feed-in, is to look at this question. We'll look at this question in class, alongside a number of the other questions that I've made for you, I should say. Critically analyze the difference between a realist and a constructivist approach to the global war on terror. And again, thank you very much for your wonderful attention, dare I say, and I thank you again for listening, and I very much look forward to seeing you again in class. Take care. Goodbye for now.